Nightfall over San Francisco Bay once carried a quiet tension, a thin, metallic stillness that seemed to settle on the water like a warning. In early 1942, the United States feared something it had never feared before: being watched. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered every assumption about distance, safety, and predictability. And on the West Coast, from Seattle to San Diego, rumors traveled faster than official reports. People whispered about Japanese submarines patrolling offshore, about reconnaissance planes slipping through clouds, about the possibility of another sudden strike. And behind those whispers, military planners knew something the public did not. Japanese long-range submarines had the capability to approach the coast, launch small seaplanes, and photograph naval infrastructure. It was rare, but absolutely possible. That possibility alone was enough to trigger a strange, quiet war, a war not fought with bullets or torpedoes, but with light, paint, mock-ups, and misdirection. Within this atmosphere, the U.S. Navy began crafting something that had no precedent. A fleet of ships that did not exist. Not models. Not drawings. But full-scale illusions, silhouettes, light patterns, hull shapes, and fake convoys designed to be seen from miles away. It was a response born not from confidence, but from fear. The fear that the Japanese might identify America's industrial heartbeat, the shipyards, fuel depots, and dry docks of the Bay Area, and strike them before the U.S. Navy could rebuild. So engineers, painters, architects, and sailors worked side by side, often after midnight, constructing deception systems along the shoreline. Lights were repositioned to mimic anchorages. Piers were disguised as distant silhouettes of heavy ships. Entire convoys were staged with minimal materials, sometimes nothing more than wooden frames, blackout curtains, and carefully designed shadows. It was a tactical illusion built for an enemy who might never appear, but whose absence could not be trusted. For the men involved, the mission felt surreal. They weren't preparing guns, they were shaping perception. Every decision revolved around a single question. If a Japanese pilot looks this way for just 3 seconds, what does he believe he's seeing? It was the beginning of one of the least known defensive operations in the United States during the Second World War, a quiet war fought long before any enemy aircraft reached the coast. And on that silent night over San Francisco Bay, a fleet began to take shape. A fleet that never truly existed, yet for a few decisive weeks helped protect everything that did. In the months after Pearl Harbor, the United States discovered a new kind of vulnerability, one that couldn't be measured by the number of ships lost or bases damaged. It was psychological. A sense that the Pacific was no longer a frontier, but a doorway left unlocked. Along the West Coast, the military's biggest fear wasn't an invasion. That possibility was remote. The real fear was observation, the idea that Japanese submarines could surface at night, launch small reconnaissance aircraft, and quietly map the Bay Area's industrial infrastructure. And history had already proven it wasn't an exaggeration. In February 1942, a Japanese submarine launched a tiny E-14Y seaplane over Australia to photograph military facilities. Later that year, another flew over Oregon, dropping incendiary bombs on a forest. These missions were small, symbolic, but they revealed a terrifying truth. If a submarine could scout Australia and bomb Oregon, it could certainly scout San Francisco. For American planners, this wasn't a theoretical risk. It was a scenario with devastating consequences. Because inside the Bay Area were the beating hearts of naval production, shipyards turning out destroyers, Liberty ships, and critical repair services. A single successful Japanese strike there could slow the entire Pacific campaign. So the Navy approached the problem from a different angle. If you can't eliminate the enemy's eyes, you can distort what they see. This idea wasn't entirely new. Camouflage experts had experimented with dazzle paint in World War I, twisting ship patterns to confuse enemy rangefinders. But what the Americans devised in 1942 went far beyond paint. It was environmental deception, shaping the visual landscape itself. And to do that, they needed specialists who understood light, shadow, and human perception. Artists from Hollywood, set designers, architects, engineers who had never served on a ship in their lives. All suddenly found themselves invited into naval offices along the West Coast, presented with a quiet challenge. How do we hide a shipyard in plain sight? Their solutions were unconventional, sometimes improvised, and always guided by a strange mix of creativity and strategic necessity. They studied how silhouettes behaved in fog. They mapped the way moonlight reflected on metal. They tested how far a false mast could be seen from offshore, and how much distortion a single misplaced spotlight could create. Little by little, a new strategy took shape, not just to hide the real fleet, but to invent another one. A phantom anchorage. A set of ships that didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't float, yet looked convincing from the distance a Japanese pilot or periscope observer might use. By early 1942, the Navy wasn't just preparing defenses. It was preparing illusions. And these illusions would soon grow into an entire shadow world, one that existed only between sunset and sunrise. A world built to be seen, and built to deceive. By the spring of 1942, the Navy's deception teams had moved from sketches and theory to something far more ambitious, constructing a false naval presence across the Bay Area. Not a handful of decoys, but the illusion of an entire American task force at anchor. The first challenge was simple to describe, yet difficult to achieve. A Japanese observer must believe the ships are real, without the ships actually existing. To do that, engineers began by studying actual naval silhouettes. From the Golden Gate to Mare Island, they photographed battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and cargo vessels at different hours of the night. They measured how light fell along the curves of a hull and how shadows behaved under fog. They noted which details remained visible at long distances, and which ones disappeared completely. From these observations came the key insight. At night, a ship was not a ship. It was a pattern of light and dark. So the Navy built those patterns. Wooden frames shaped like bows and sterns. Towers that mimicked bridge structures. Canvas stretched to resemble the sloping faces of superstructures. And most importantly, carefully placed lights, dimmed, shielded, angled, to mimic the glow that a real ship would produce under blackout conditions. From a distance, especially from the viewpoint of a submarine periscope or a reconnaissance plane flying low over the coast, the effect was startling. The decoys didn't look perfect. They didn't need to. They simply had to look probable. A Japanese pilot glancing down for 2 or 3 seconds wouldn't question them. A submarine officer peering through a periscope at night wouldn't have time to study imperfections. The illusion lived in that narrow band of perception, a moment where the human eye connected dots whether they existed or not. But light and shadows weren't enough. The Americans needed scale. So entire piers were turned into the outlines of large warships. Long warehouses were reshaped with painted windows to resemble decks. Metal scaffolding was added to create false masts. Even tugboats played a role, positioning themselves near decoy hulls to give the impression of activity. It was engineering mixed with theater. War blended with stagecraft. And it didn't stop at ships. The Navy disguised industrial buildings with camouflage nets, false roofs, and paint meant to break their geometric forms. Fuel tanks were covered to look like civilian storage. Some structures were intentionally darkened, others were lit just enough to appear irrelevant. Viewed from offshore, the Bay Area became a puzzle, a landscape where the essential pieces were hidden and the meaningless ones were highlighted. To the people building the illusion, the work felt both urgent and strangely intimate. Many of them had never been close to war before. They were artists, electricians, carpenters, suddenly responsible for whether an enemy pilot spotted a shipyard that produced real destroyers. They worked quietly at night, in cold wind, hammering wood and adjusting lights as if they were preparing a stage that no audience would ever admit existed. But every evening, when the sun dipped behind the Pacific, their creation came alive. A fleet took shape where no fleet was anchored. A task force appeared where only shadows had been. And the United States, for the first time in its history, defended itself with a navy made of illusion. As the decoy fleet expanded across the bay, the Navy knew the illusion was only as strong as its first real test. And that test came sooner than anyone expected. In the summer of 1942, Japanese submarines began appearing along the American west coast with unsettling frequency. Some shelled coastal refineries. Others launched reconnaissance seaplanes. One even attacked an oil field in Southern California, sending American civilians scrambling for shelter. For the deception teams in San Francisco, these incidents weren't distant events. They were signals, clear, sharp reminders that the Pacific was not a buffer but a corridor. If a submarine could rise within sight of Los Angeles, then it could rise off the Golden Gate. And if it did, the first thing its periscope would catch was the bay. Inside naval command posts, officers reviewed intelligence reports that described Japanese reconnaissance procedures. Submarine-launched aircraft flew low, fast, and rarely circled. Periscope observations were often brief and taken under poor conditions. Everything depended on seconds, and on the assumption that the human eye, when rushed, filled in the gaps. This was exactly the environment the American illusion was designed for. But assumptions had to be tested. So the Navy began conducting its own reconnaissance trials. Under controlled conditions, pilots flew along the coastline at night, taking photographs and recording impressions exactly as an enemy scout would. Their goal wasn't to evaluate the beauty of the decoys, it was to judge their believability. And the results surprised even the engineers. From altitude, the false ships blended convincingly with the water. Their silhouettes were distorted, but the distortion looked natural, the kind caused by fog, haze, and distance. Lights placed along the piers created the impression of depth and movement, even though nothing moved at all. Pilots reported that the decoys felt like real vessels, anchored and waiting. Even more impressive, the real shipyards behind them became almost invisible. Hangars vanished into darkened grids. Fuel tanks dissolved into shadow. Production lines that ran day and night disappeared beneath layers of camouflage netting and false roofs. From the air, the bay looked busy, but not militarily significant. Exactly the illusion the Navy needed. Meanwhile, offshore, American patrols detected a Japanese submarine operating uncomfortably close to the coast. Though the enemy vessel never surfaced near the bay, its presence confirmed everything planners feared. The Japanese were probing, watching, listening, and if they chose to launch a reconnaissance aircraft from a submarine deck, a daring but entirely possible act, that tiny plane would see the scene the Americans had constructed. A phantom task force. A silent navy of shadows. And behind it, nothing worth bombing. For the first time since the operation began, the United States felt a small shift. Not victory, not relief, but confidence. The illusion worked. Or at least, it worked well enough to matter. Night after night, as fog rolled across the water and lights flickered against wooden silhouettes, the Bay Area played its part in a war of perception. A war fought without gunfire, but with consequences as real as any battle. Success brought confidence, but it also brought a new kind of pressure. Once the illusion worked, it had to keep working. Night after night, week after week, without slipping, without revealing a single seam. And the truth was far less glamorous than the concept. The decoy fleet, for all its cleverness, was fragile. Wood warped under fog. Canvas swelled in the cold. Paint peeled under salt air. Lights short-circuited in the middle of the night. Every evening, crews of sailors, engineers, and civilian technicians walked the piers with clipboards and flashlights, checking mast frames, shadow panels, and light boxes. It wasn't strategic work, it was maintenance. Quiet, repetitive, exhausting. But if one element failed, the illusion could collapse. One night, a fog bank settled too quickly, trapping moisture against a large canvas superstructure. By dawn, the frame had sagged almost a full foot, transforming a supposed cruiser silhouette into something closer to a fishing barge. It was fixed before sunset, but the incident reminded everyone of the truth. The U.S. Navy's most unusual fleet could dissolve in a single night. Meanwhile, intelligence reports continued to warn of Japanese submarines working up and down the west coast. Each sighting sent a ripple of tension across the bay. Whenever a submarine radio transmission was intercepted, even a faint, distant one, commanders reviewed the decoy positions, checking angles, sight lines, and shadow patterns as if preparing for an inspection by an enemy who would never announce his arrival. The pressure was psychological as much as technical. The people running the operation knew the enemy might never come. They also knew that if he did come, even for a brief reconnaissance pass, everything depended on their work holding up. One electrician later described it simply. We weren't building ships. We were building confidence. But confidence required constant effort. On some nights, winds blew from the Pacific with enough force to shake scaffolding and tear camouflage netting from rooftops. Technicians climbed ladders in freezing air, securing cables and adjusting lights, whispering to each other so their voices wouldn't carry across the water. On other nights, the challenge wasn't wind, it was silence. Dead calm. Water so still it reflected the decoy lights too cleanly, making everything look too perfect, too staged. Crews had to reposition lamps, dim others, and add irregularity to the patterns to recreate the subtle randomness of a living naval anchorage. Authenticity depended on imperfection. And yet, for all the stress, the operation fostered a strange sense of camaraderie. Sailors who normally repaired engines now aligned shadows on fake hulls. Artists who once painted Hollywood sets now mixed pigments to imitate moonlit steel. They shared coffee, jokes, and quiet frustration under blackout conditions, a group of people who never expected to serve in a war like this. Because this wasn't the kind of story that made headlines. This wasn't a battle. There were no medals to award, no official recognition, no loud victories. Their job was to make sure nothing happened. And in war, preventing something is far more difficult than causing it. Yet every night, when the final lights were adjusted and the phantom ships took shape over the dark water, there was a moment, brief, silent, when the crews stepped back and looked across the bay. And for that moment, the illusion felt real. A fleet that existed only because the United States needed it to exist. A fleet built from fear, ingenuity, and determination. A fleet meant to be seen by the enemy. And believed. Late in the summer of 1942, the bay was wrapped in a thin, pale fog, the kind that softened lights and blurred distances. It was the kind of night the deception teams liked. The illusion always worked better when nature cooperated. But shortly after midnight, a message reached the Coastal Command Center that changed everything. A Navy listening station had picked up a faint radar echo offshore, small, fast-moving, low to the water. It didn't match commercial traffic. It didn't match U.S. patrol routes. And it was heading west to east, toward the coast. For the officers on duty, there was only one possibility. A Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. Launched from a submarine. Flying low to avoid radar. Hunting for American infrastructure, fuel, ships, shipyards. The room fell into an instant, controlled tension. No shouting. No panic. Just a shift in posture, in tone, in breathing. Everyone knew the protocol. Blackouts confirmed, decoy lights active, personnel clear of open surfaces. But tension seeped through every layer of silence. For the first time, the illusion might actually be seen by the enemy it was built for. Meanwhile, out on the piers, a skeleton crew maintained the decoy installations. They didn't know about the radar contact yet, only that something felt different. The wind had died. The fog was thickening. And the bay, usually humming with distant machinery, seemed unusually quiet. Then the message reached them. Possible reconnaissance aircraft inbound. Hold positions. Maintain blackout. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply waited as the fog glowed faintly around the outlines of their false fleet. Out at sea, the unidentified echo continued its slow approach. Inside the command center, an intelligence officer studied maps and distances with a growing sense of inevitability. If the contact held its current heading, it would pass directly in front of the Golden Gate, the perfect line to observe the bay. And that meant that for a few seconds, maybe 10, maybe less, a Japanese pilot might see exactly what the Americans had spent months constructing. But would he believe it? The question hung over the room like a weight. If the decoys failed, the enemy would identify key targets immediately. If they succeeded, the enemy would see only what the United States wanted him to see. Minutes stretched. The Echo reached the critical zone, the line where an observer would have the clearest angled view into San Francisco Bay. On the piers, the crews watched the horizon in silence. The fake silhouettes, the wooden bows, the canvas superstructures, the calculated patterns of dimmed lights, all seemed to hold their breath. And then, nothing happened. No bombs. No sudden illumination. No attack run. But the radar team watched the blip pause for a moment, just a heartbeat, before veering south and disappearing into the dark. That brief hesitation meant everything. The pilot had looked. He had seen something. And whatever he saw, it hadn't pushed him to attack. Inside the command center, tension eased just slightly. Not relief, but a cautious, measured exhale. The illusion had held. Maybe the contact was Japanese. Maybe it wasn't. The records would never say for certain. But to the men and women who built the Phantom Fleet, that night became the definitive moment when their work felt real. Because for the first time, their ships of wood and shadow had faced the possibility of being judged by an enemy pilot. And they had passed. As 1943 unfolded, the Pacific began to shift. The United States was no longer reacting, it was advancing. Island by island, mile by mile, American forces pushed westward, tightening the pressure on Japanese supply lines and stretching the reach of their own. With every new airfield built across the ocean, with every carrier task force launched into deeper waters, the fear that had once hung over the west coast began to fade. Submarines still prowled offshore from time to time, but the sense of imminent danger, the feeling that a single reconnaissance plane could change everything, slowly dissolved. Inside the Bay Area, the change was subtle at first. Lights that had been dimmed for months were allowed to burn brighter. Shipyards increased their nighttime activity, trusting improved defenses and expanding patrol coverage. Workers who once walked under blackout restrictions now moved through a city returning to its natural rhythm. And the decoy fleet remained where it was, suspended somewhere between necessity and nostalgia. Maintenance teams still visited the silhouettes each evening, but their routine had lost its earlier urgency. They knew the chances of another reconnaissance attempt were shrinking. The war was pulling the enemy in the opposite direction. Slowly, the fake ships began to show their age. Wooden frames sagged. Canvas panels frayed. Paint faded under months of fog and salt air. Yet none of it felt like negligence, it felt like history catching up. What had once been a defensive marvel was now a reminder of a moment when the United States had stood vulnerable, uncertain, and afraid, a moment that now seemed almost distant. For the crews who kept the illusion alive, the fading threat brought mixed emotions. Some felt relief. Others felt a surprising sense of loss. They had spent months crafting a fleet that existed only at night, a fleet that very few Americans even knew about. Watching it decline felt like watching a chapter close before anyone had truly read it. And still, the illusion served a purpose. Even as the threat diminished, the Navy didn't dismantle the decoys immediately. Intelligence officers insisted on maintaining them a little longer, not because they expected an attack, but because uncertainty still lingered. The war was vast. The Pacific was unpredictable. And the illusion, even weakened, still offered a layer of psychological defense. But everyone knew the end was coming. The Bay Area no longer needed shadows to hide behind. Its strength now came from the ships being launched. Real ships, steel ships, vessels that carried the fighting spirit of a nation gaining momentum. By late 1943, one quiet decision after another signaled that the work of the deception teams was nearly over. Fewer repairs were logged. Fewer lights were adjusted. Some nights, the silhouettes remained dark entirely, left to blend into the natural shapes of the shoreline. The Phantom Fleet had served its purpose. And as the United States moved deeper into the Pacific, the illusions that once protected the West Coast felt less like defenses and more like echoes, reminders of a fragile moment that the country had survived. Soon, the fleet would disappear. But the memory of those strange nights, when America defended its coast with shadows, would linger far longer than the decoys themselves. By early 1944, the Phantom Fleet of San Francisco Bay was little more than a memory in motion. Some decoys still stood where they had been placed, leaning slightly, worn down by wind and salt. Others were quietly removed, their frames taken apart and reused, their lights boxed and stored without ceremony. There was no parade, no public announcement, no photograph in the newspaper. The illusion simply faded, slipping back into the same shadows it had once commanded. And for most Americans, it had never existed at all. But for the men and women who built it, the dismantling of the decoys felt strangely profound. They had spent months shaping light, shadow, and perception, a craft that demanded patience, precision, and a kind of creativity not usually associated with wartime service. They had protected the bay not with armor or artillery, but with an understanding of how the human eye interprets the night. Their success was measured in something that didn't happen. No Japanese plane ever identified the shipyards. No attack struck the heart of West Coast industry. No reconnaissance mission returned with coordinates that could have changed the course of the Pacific War. In military history, the absence of disaster is rarely celebrated. But here, absence was victory. As the Pacific Campaign accelerated, the United States no longer needed illusions to defend its shores. Real fleets, powerful, mobile, relentless, carried the war toward Japan. The fear that had once defined the West Coast transformed into something else. Determination, confidence, momentum. Still, the Phantom Fleet left a quiet legacy. It demonstrated that warfare wasn't only fought with steel and gunpowder. It could be fought with creativity, with deception, with the understanding that sometimes victory depends not on what the enemy sees, but on what you ensure he never truly sees at all. Years later, when veterans of the operation spoke about those nights, their recollections carried a soft, reflective tone. They remembered the fog rolling across the water, the glow of carefully shielded bulbs, the soft creak of wooden frames pretending to be steel. They remembered the tension of waiting for an enemy who might never appear, and the relief of knowing their work made the enemy's task harder. Most of all, they remembered the feeling of being part of something hidden yet essential. A quiet defense. A fragile illusion built with steady hands. A moment when the United States protected itself with shadows. Today, the Phantom Fleet is little more than a footnote in the vast story of the Second World War. But its impact remains, a reminder that even in the largest conflict in human history, small, unseen actions could shape the outcome just as surely as any battle. And on those nights in 1942, when the bay glimmered with the silhouettes of ships that weren't really there, the United States proved something rare. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one the enemy believes exists.